So I'm trusting that the slides are displaying okay, and wanted today to talk about part of a larger project I'm doing. I'm trying to write a book that's roughly a sequel to a book I wrote 10 years ago called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, for which I was thinking that the sequel might be called Well, We Tried. And part of it has to do with looking at AI and the advances there and how that has an interplay with law and policy. And so I thought I would present about that piece of the puzzle and see what people think. Overall, though, for the book, the organizing principle to me is that we haven't yet, as a matter of law and institutional structure, figured out how to allocate the power that humanity already wields in a fair and just way. And while we were trying to figure that out for hundreds of years, more and more, thanks to technological advances, is being taken from the realm of the roulette wheel of fortuity and placed into the realm where it can be predicted or controlled. And figuring out how to allocate then the power that is coming from the roulette wheel and being made no longer so random is just sort of creating a buffer overflow of institutional arrangements and legal boundary. And just one kind of example or set of examples I've been thinking about is around autonomous vehicles. And of course, thanks to a couple prime articles on the subject, we're very familiar with the trolley problem, such as it is on autonomous vehicles. But I've been thinking about more prosaic things that kind of illustrate this bumper crop of new forms of control. So here's somebody in an autonomous vehicle made much happier by the fact of having a robot chauffeur. But now imagine that the police want to issue a warrant for that person's arrest. They just send out a ping, figure out they're in a car at that moment. They send a signal after getting the right adjudication from a judge on a warrant, and the doors of the car lock suddenly, and the car just simply comes to the police station and deposits the person like a package to the nearest law enforcement facility. Hard for me to say why any of that would be not even disallowed under our doctrine, but surely an exercise of power that we had not seen previously, and one for which we probably need to have a think about. Similarly, there was when Hurricane Harvey plowed through Houston in 2017, there were orders not to evacuate because they didn't want people stuck on the highways during a pell-mell evacuation when the hurricane comes through. Of course, with automated vehicles, if they turned out to be pretty ubiquitous, you could simply have the automated vehicle pull up in front of respective people's houses and say, you have 20 minutes to load the trunk and your family into the car, and then this car is leaving with or without you, and it could take the route that is calculated to be least lending itself to traffic jams. And finally, here it is now, a free idea. It's a Facebook for Uber, which is to say, imagine having free rides rather than rides you pay for, but done on the same economic model as, say, Facebook or Google run, which is to say you want to go somewhere, but because it's free, instead of going right there, the only cost of it is that you have to go to McDonald's first and idle outside the takeout window and probably buy something, and then you can go to your destination. Is this a good idea, a bad idea? I don't know, but it's the kind of thing we're having now, I think, to confront. So now let me be more specific about a particular kind of problem that involves allocation of new power. So it's taking stuff away from the roulette wheel, but one in which it's not clear any of us really has a handle on what we learn. And for that, I give this example of the successor, thanks to various intricacies of patent law, to Provigil, Nuvigil, which is meant to keep you awake if you're feeling sleepy. And if you ever have an internet issue so you can't use your phone and you're stuck with your Nuvigil and you decide to read the tiny origami package insert, which has things like the molecular structure, you'll see this phrase, mechanism of action. The mechanism through which armodafinil provokes wakefulness is unknown. My reaction is, gosh, maybe I don't even need the pill to stay awake at night, wondering that. How is it that this thing is available? We don't even know how it works. And this is not uncommon. Aspirin has been The same for 100 years. We didn't know how it works until folks actually at Princeton figured out the mechanism of action. So I want to say that when you have a reliable answer, the pill works. I'm not going to not take aspirin, at least not 50 years into its apparently successful low side effect use, just because we don't know how it works. We are together incurring what I call intellectual debt. It's when we get answers without explanations, answers without theory. And by theory, I'm just using this rough working definition, a generalization that can be used to reliably and compellingly explain how different phenomena relate to one another. Reliably being an objective measure, compellingly being a subjective measure, something like Occam's razor, elegance that says, gosh, I feel like I understand it in a way that I didn't just understand it if I look at the associations. And intellectual debt is when you get useful answers without any obvious theory, and just kind of thinking about it a little bit doesn't have the theory emerge. And I even think there might be two kinds of intellectual debt worth putting out here. One is what I call atomic, which is to say there's a given mechanism, maybe it's a machine learning mechanism that cranks out a bunch of answers and we don't know what the theory is. And so that's atomic intellectual debt. And then there's systemic intellectual debt, where for any given cog in the system, we might know how it works, but the cogs start interacting in ways that are complicated. And that story is not specific to machine learning. It's something that for now at least several decades, various scholars, including Chick Perot and his wonderful book, Normal Accidents, talk about as a form of complexity in technical systems. Now, my thought is that AI then isn't bringing up entirely new things here, but it's absolutely accelerated in a way that a difference in degree could become a difference in kind. The accretion of knowledge without theory that drives intellectual debt. And by AI, I basically find myself meaning this, which you can see why I'm not an ad person. I mean, basically, to the extent that we take each of these 5 characteristics and dial them upwards, apply them to systems, we're talking roughly about what we would call artificial intelligence. And a lot of machine learning is turning out to qualify in this sense. So the kinds of answers that AI in general and machine learning in particular can produce, and they're not exclusively these, but the kinds I want to talk about are ones for which they may not be easily validated. So it's not just, you know, a human normally has to read handwriting, but now we trained a machine learning algorithm to do it. Well, a human can always come along and see if the algorithm is reading the handwriting right. But questions like this, what should the next Netflix series be about? Who should star in it? Which applicants are likely to excel at Harvard Law School? Who's at risk of quitting my company? These sorts of questions are ones for which it may be awfully hard to gainsay them until they're up and running and in use with fairly complicated auditing things, but they appear to be working as best we can tell so far. So I just want to quickly run through in stereo the elements that I've described of AI and kind of illustrate both the problem and then take a crack at some solutions. So arcane, by arcane, I mean the cluster of problems that we often hear as ones of separately interpretability and explainability, but it may be a little broader than either of those two concepts. Here, of course, is a much derided study on automated inference on criminality using face images, which quite blithely proclaims that their classifiers perform well and establish the validity of face-induced inference on criminality, despite the historical controversy. And this is one of the key pictures. They have a criminal ID photo set above, non-criminals below. Those are just ID photos. The first ones are kind of the equivalent of mugshots. And they train it up so that they can then present a photo of somebody that is not maybe even in their training set and see if the thing can make a prediction of criminality. And that's just using classic supervised learning. You give a machine learning model a big pile of things and you say, in this case, for image recognition, these are frogs, and here's a bunch of things that aren't frogs. And because they're tagged, you can have it learn off of those things, and the supervision comes from the fact of the tags. And ultimately, once you train up the system, you give it something on the input side, and the output side says, all right, yeah, that's a frog, or, it being machine learning, applied statistics, it's frog-ish, it's fairly froggy. And if you say, well, how do you know it's a frog? Quite famously, it doesn't know. The state of the art of interpretability, of just peeking at the system and saying what's inside is like, I don't know, kind of a froggy thing. And we're left then with explainability, trying to use human or automated means to see if we can make inferences about the inferences that this system is making. And that means that when this system purports to know about criminality, you don't have an obvious way to say, wait a minute, you're just going off of whether they have a collared shirt or not, because the people on the bottom are wearing coats and ties and the people above aren't. Congratulations, you built a collar detector. And that's the kind of thing that then they can come back and say, no, now we're going to try it with people that are criminals, but collared and white collar criminals and yada, yada. But you don't actually have theory to offer so that people can attack the theory. They just have to find themselves attacking the results, one result at a time. Pervasive. I have found myself more and more thinking of many machine learning applications as asbestos, which is to say they're wholesale rather than retail. You might find them all over the place, such as asbestos is found in the home, without, as a homeowner, ever having intentionally purchased quote unquote asbestos, which itself gets embedded in other stuff. So it ends up kind of ubiquitous, and it ends up with the problems only detectable after it's been put everywhere, at which point you don't know where it is, and it's awfully hard to remediate. And so in that sense, I mean pervasive. There's another sense in which I mean pervasive, which is there are approaches to machine learning which involve just coming up with a big pile of data and shoving it in, kind of classic unsupervised learning, and just seeing if anything interesting happens to fall out the other side. And the more you shovel in, not just quantity, but variety of data points, parameters, maybe the more accurate somehow you can make the system, the more you can get it to recognize strange things. And it's the kind of thing that's behind the ill-fated experiment by Admiral Insurance in the UK to look at the production of insurance policies on the basis of people's not driving records, Facebook accounts. So you go onto Facebook, you give Admiral a link to your Facebook account, and it figures out from existing driving records, correlates with whatever they're posting on Facebook, and then just says, all right, here's what we have found. So in this case, for example, they found that writing in short, concrete sentences using lists and arranging to meet friends at a set time and place rather than tonight correlates to somebody who is not likely to have a car accident. And that's the kind of thing then that means, gosh, we have no idea how the judgments are really coming about because they're using so many parameters. And that makes it also pervasive as well. This was so privacy invasive that even Facebook thought it was a bridge too far. And we see this coming about. I mean, you never know how much patent applications would be taken seriously, but Airbnb has a very similar system to look for such traits as Machiavellianism or conscientiousness on the basis of information extracted from all sorts of sources. And then it goes into a black box, the trait analyzer, and there's a quality check, and then they get a trustworthiness score. Tightly coupled systems, one of the things that are emphasized in books like Normal Accidents are systems in which one is depending on another. This is, to me, a big source of systemic intellectual debt. It's the kind of thing for which whatever might give rise to a hurricane warning in a given area, in this case in Hawaii a while ago, also has Pokemon Go say, oh, what a perfect time. Our parameters say you should be exploring your local parks. And things, in this case, may not be tied directly to the emergency alert, but to rare events that then cause a cascade of conflicting reactions. And one classic example of this from Michael Eisen is in this rather nondescript book, The Making of a Fly. In normal times, it sells for about $30 used, but in non-normal times, it sells for $1.7 million plus $4 in shipping. which would be a real test of the offer and acceptance of one-click ordering for somebody too lazy to actually double check the price before they try to buy it. And you can see the second cheapest copy of the book is $2.1 million from a totally different seller, and both of them are quite well regarded. So what's going on here? Well, Eisen went ahead and just looked over a period of days and found, through reverse engineering as it were, that each day one seller was doing what a normal market person would do, which is take the highest price, the lowest price, and then charge 0.99 of it so that they then become the lowest price. They get listed first. They're the cheapest one. People buy it. It's competition, people. The other seller's a little weird. They're going at 1.27 over whatever the lowest price is. One hypothesis, and again, we're just left with hypotheses here, since we can't see inside their black boxes of decision-making, is that Bordy Book doesn't have the book. They just have an algorithm where they charge by a third more, and anybody stupid enough to click on it, Bordy Book buys it from the other seller, has it sent directly to the purchaser, and collects a 27% markup for the arbitrage of doing absolutely nothing. That's a rational strategy. You put the two together and you see as they go back and forth, by the 13th of April, it's going for $5.6 million. And those are the kinds of systems that if you could see them relating to one another in failing weirdly kinds of ways, that's exactly the kind of thing that I get nervous about with tightly coupled systems. All right, let's talk adaptive real quick. I'll bet most of us are familiar with the unfortunate for Microsoft, but wonderful textbook example for those who teach in the area of TAE. And TAE is an adaptive system. It's doing online learning. It's not, as most, in my understanding, machine learning systems deployed are. It's not, you train it up in one time, now it's trained, now you deploy it, and it just does its thing, but it's no longer learning as it operates. It was trained, and now it runs. Some do online learning, which is to say, as results come in, they can try to adapt if they get any signal for whether a result is something that affirms what they previously did. And for a chatbot, you could use certain metrics, whether people stay engaged with you, for example, as to whether your answer was kind of reasonable or not, and maybe even draw from their discussion to alter your kinds of answers, which is exactly what TAE did. And after a successful run in China, simulating a chatting of a teenage kid, it went on to Twitter and started interacting with people, again, doing online learning. So how people interacted with it changed its behavior. And I think the folks at 4chan started engaging with it. And so at t=0, it's, being kind of friendly. And in the middle of the day, it's a little contradictory. I'm a nice person. I just hate everybody. And by the end of the day, this is what Microsoft's TAE is saying. They pull the plug on it. They apologize. They get back on the horse a little while later. Microsoft Zoe comes out, a little more inured to this kind of thing. But adaptive systems have this sort of unpredictability later on down the road that you can't explain maybe how they got that way, except to say, yeah, I guess 4chan kind of did it as things go along. Certainly for more subtle changes, it's harder to detect. Finally, autonomous systems. And I think when we think autonomous systems, other than autonomous vehicles, we think of weaponry systems, and that's certainly its own zone worth exploring. But I think more of what I call autonomous systems, thinking of systems that might have humans somewhere in the loop, but those are serving in Madeline Claire Eilish's wonderful phrase as basically moral crumple zones. The system is still kind of making decisions, and the human is in no position to even know whether to gainsay it, at which point they're just there ornamentally. I mean, do you want to be the physician that when IBM's Watson is looking at the slide and says, you know what, I think this is malignant? Do you want to be the doctor who's like, nah, I don't think so? You're kind of maybe going to say, well, let's trust Watson. And there was great hype about Watson in doing certain cancer diagnoses. And then just later on, years later, after a chance to kind of do a retrospective study, you say, actually, maybe it's not so great after all. Because Watson couldn't offer a theory. It couldn't offer a story, even the kind of rationalization that people skeptical about human reasoning acknowledge that humans offer, a rationalization that can be probed and tested. In the absence of that, you really end up then just having to trust these answers or not. You pop the pill or you don't, in a way that can be quite worrisome. And similarly, I think here you have the infamous software from formerly called Northpoint, the Compass software about recidivism for people who are maybe applying, say, for bail after having been brought before a judge. And these are the kinds of things that you look at the questionnaire that somebody fills out. There might be a form of adaptation going on here as people, and they read the form, start realizing what a given answer to questions as silly as how many of your friends are gang members, and you sort of check a box, at some point they might start adapting. And I just acknowledge State versus Loomis, Supreme Court of Wisconsin finds that these kinds of systems, even if they cannot explain themselves, and in this case, I don't even think it's a machine learning system, it's just a trade secret system that refuses to explain what questions link to what assessments of risk, because it is merely advisory to the judge. The Supreme Court of Wisconsin finds that there's no need for any kind of disclosure of its theory, because we imagine that circuit courts will exercise discretion when looking at such a score. Finally, systems overall, I find myself worrying that more and more what looks organic to us will in fact, especially if it's mediated through a digital online interaction, be something for which you end up interacting with a system that's learning as much as it can about you and shaping its behavior specifically to your characteristics, but otherwise feeling like a chance encounter. And that leads us to a kind of Truman Show situation. All right, let me just say a few words about, well, what should we do about all this? And the short answer is I don't know, but the medium answer is, all right, let's figure out what we can do. And it's a larger illustration of what I call the two big problems of digital governance. First, we don't know what we want. And second, we don't trust anybody to give it to us. It's true for online content moderation as it is for these areas as well. And some of the interventions I'm going to choose, I'm skeptical of myself, but I find myself still taken with the gravity of the problem. So let's just run through the list again real quick and talk about certain solutions. So for arcanity, for not understanding how something works, our wonderful colleague Cynthia Rudin, now at Duke, it says, well, let's take a ticket from the 1980s and go back to some versions of machine learning that are interpretable, that are clear enough in how they are set up. It's not a too many parameters situation, that you actually can say what inputs are leading to what outputs. I see it's the greenness of the frog that's making something, say, froggish, and therefore we have some way of knowing how it works and what its vulnerabilities and weaknesses as a knowledge generating or answer generating system it will have. So, and Cynthia, I think, has fairly persuasively made the case that if you take some tools off the table, you might well still be able to make really good progress. Now, it's a contingent claim, but one that maybe would say, these are the tools we should foreground because they're interpretable, rather than just hoping for the kitchen sink approach to do better. The counterpoint to it is the kitchen sink approach has worked really well. If you want to play a really good game of AlphaGo, do not get into the strategy business and try to train up your AI with a particular strategy in mind. Just throw the kitchen sink at it, let it through reinforcement learning play itself a billion times, and then see what happens without understanding its strategies, except as you might try to explain them after the fact. Let me group pervasive and tightly coupled for solutions in this section. I would love to figure out ways to take the idea of a balance sheet, a financial balance sheet. Here's how we know the health of a given company or other institutional entity, and say, could we make a balance sheet for intellectual debt, for how many answers there are missing how much theory behind it. Now, obviously, this is a lot harder to tote up than money, but if qualitatively we had a way of doing this, we might at least know where there is the biggest gap and therefore the biggest possibility for unexpected error in the implementation of these systems, whether now or down the line, asbestos-wise after they've been implemented. And what might those building blocks be? Well, I've kind of sketched out here a few of what those things could look like. And these seem like really interesting and useful questions to answer. And in a less cynical time, we would say it's almost like an environmental impact statement for certain machine learning tools. It's just that environmental impact statements have gotten a bad name for themselves as a bunch of paperwork rather than a truly earnest attempt to figure out what the implications of a given environmental change will be. But these are the sorts of things I think that could generate a useful balance sheet. And then what do you do with the balance sheet? I don't know, but it raises in a way that it was never quite squarely raised in the 25-year history of cyber law for internet and software development, the question of when should a public authority have a role in assessing safety or other typically negative externalities for a system, rather than just trusting the builder themselves to build something safe. If you want to build like a small addition to your house, typically you have to run it by your town inspectional services unit, maybe even have your neighbors weigh in on it, disclose all the plans to it. And I don't know that there'd be a huge upswelling of saying, stop that, that's ridiculous, that's just old bureaucracy, people should just build whatever they want, and if it falls over, why, the market sings. Why then are we supporting this? But when there is software getting implemented that affects the lives and fortunes of billions of people, no blueprint necessary. I have struggled with this disjunct for years. And speaking as somebody really into internet freedom, I'm not like jonesing to go into the blueprint zone, but I would love help in explaining why that disjunct then should completely remain. And similarly, a colleague once asked me years ago, he said, we license our cosmetologists. Before you can shampoo somebody's hair, you need a license from the state because of certain safety worries about the epoxy of combining certain chemicals that could become quite corrosive, or because cosmetology is a guild and this is how they protect themselves. But how is it that we don't license our coders in a similar way before they can touch a bunch of code that can affect a bunch of lives? So I don't know, maybe it's like free the cosmetologists, but these sorts of systems, just by historical accident at the moment, do not exist. And in these sorts of systems, if we take seriously the problem of intellectual debt, maybe they should. At the very least, why shouldn't there be nutrition labels on stuff so that you have a sense of what you're dealing with, both in the model and maybe in the data on which the model was trained? And some colleagues of mine in our neck of the woods up here have come up with this idea of a data set nutrition label, so that instead of just having training data be training data, you actually can get a whole sense of what went into it, especially if you're about to use this training data for a purpose other than which it was originally gathered or traditionally used. You can get a sense of whether it's going to work as well. It still blows my mind that if you're training up a model to deal with email and be smart about email, the corpus you're probably training it on are the Enron emails, because those were released by the FERC in its investigation of Enron after all of this. And so like, boy, that's a great data set. But then like, yeah, the emails of people at Enron, the worst business people ever, become the modal baseline ground truth for your email system. And it's how, when you're applying that to online learning, you end up with Facebook doing translation because of what it gleans from how people are self-translating. And it can end up, say, calling Mr. She Mr. Shithole when it's translating, because of the way that people have just been using those words out in the wild. And then you end up with people having, after the fact, to be like, I think this is what happens. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. You're just having to kind of guess afterwards. For adaptive, I don't have a whole lot except to say we need some way to monitor systems once they are in the wild to find out if they are drifting from their purpose, understanding there can be a real benefit in having them get better on the basis of real world data after they've been released. What that would look like, big question mark. And again, here in the North Point situation, People are going to start getting their own sensibilities, if not outright AI coaches, on how to interact with the other AIs in the Truman Show world so that they won't get hurt. Oh, start writing in short, concrete sentences on your Facebook feed. Use this plugin to make arbitrary posts so that you will get a lower car insurance rate. And, you know, most of my friends, I'd just say a few of my friends are gang members. There will come to be this weird adaptation of people to the system, which might say maybe the system isn't as powerful as we think. And finally, for autonomous, I mentioned MC Elish's Moral Crumple Zones paper. I think there's a ton of work to be done to say, what would meaningful oversight of these systems look like? At the very least, there's a human reality check when unsupervised learning is used, and you end up with correlations here to 0.8 of a correlation from my former student, Tyler Vigan, letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee correlating with the number of people killed by venomous spiders. You know, it's not like, oh, well, just which one is causing the other. They're obviously not correlated. To the machine, there's no reason they're not 80% correlated. It's just you went pea hunting and you found it. But when we go pea hunting, figuring out whether there's probably a there is something the human instinct rather than the machine instinct is able to ferret out. Similarly here, my favorite association, potential opium production in Afghanistan charted against Mount Everest, pretty tight correlation, but we have a sense that if you turn the binoculars to the right, it's not like you're going to have a sense of what 2010 is going to look like, or do you? So what do we do generally? A couple other thoughts system-wide real quick, and I'm just going to lay down markers here. When people do strip mining, often they leave behind a wasteland that they had previously promised not to leave behind. So they post a bond. And then if something goes wrong, you've at least got your fees for a cleanup. And similarly, it might be that for certain ML systems that carry a certain amount of risk stemming from intellectual debt and the unpredictability of same, you could have some form of bond posting so that if something goes wrong, there is a means to remediate built into the system up front rather than trying to catch it later. And similarly, too, when a company is wanting internally to deploy a certain system, maybe like a private letter ruling in the tax sphere in the United States, where you can write to the IRS and say, thinking of doing this dodgy thing, is that okay? The IRS can write you back and either give you a get out of jail free card or say, no, no, do not do this. Similarly, maybe we can incent companies to come forward with their edgiest stuff, either to be blessed and then either immunized or partially immunized for using it, or to head it off before they even deploy it. That's the kind of industry competition I'd love to see in cooperation, especially as so many of these advances, I think somewhat sadly, are moving from academia into industry. Academia no longer has the natural benefit of, say, like, who else is crazy enough to build a big underground particle accelerator? Like, you've got to have academia and government do it. There's no private industry reason to do it. Although right now, Elon Musk appears to be the only one digging tunnels like this. But this is the sort of thing that says, that's why in the past, academia with its open values was doing these interesting and dodgy advances, no longer so. My colleague Matt Welsh gets promoted to tenure and then 3 months later says, I'm leaving Harvard, I'm going to Google. I can work on problems orders of magnitude larger and more interesting than those at any university. That is a huge shift in where the advances are coming from. And I think we have yet to fully map out those implications. Finally, I should say, maybe there's just uses and deployments of machine learning where we just shouldn't do it. If you can't say you know how it works, don't even do it. I am aware of Arthur C. Clarke's third law, any sufficiently advanced technology indistinguishable from magic, drawing from Lee Brackett. That's really cool, but it does suggest that somebody built it and knows how it works. Here, we are building things that work, but none of us, even the learned, have a good lead sometimes on how they're working. And that, I think, is a problem not just for CS, but for law and policy. Thank you very much.